The following video is about a fictional basketball association set in a different world with fictional players, teams, and lore. If you are interested in hearing the full story, stay tuned for upcoming videos. So, this is the founding story of the Raisa Basketball Association. So, starting off, the world before Emmanuel Raisa. A long time ago, back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, basketball was not just the people's game that everyone knows and loves today. Its inventor, Jack Roddenwell, had a clear vision of what he wanted the sport to be, which was a prestigious indoor winter sport specifically made for private athletic clubs, military academies, social clubs, and wealthy recreation centers, which was seen almost as a gentleman's sport, which was fully organized, controlled, and expensive, and was not really something that was open to the public or readily accessible to the public. Unlike football, baseball, and other popular street games at the time, basketball was not something most kids knew because it was hard to play competitively in these leagues. You would need money and funding and connections. Public outdoor sports hardly really even existed when it came to basketball, and most real basketball games would always happen inside of private gyms and athletic clubs and paid academies. So this was kind of walled off to the average person. And basketball wasn't like a hush hush thing, but it wasn't really talked about widely or regarded as one of the main sports at this time. To be noticed as a basketball player, a young player would essentially need three things. One would be a membership to a private athletic club, and they would also need a spot on an expensive travel team, as well as connections to other basketball players, as I mentioned before. But this made basketball incredibly hard for people in poor areas because they didn't know where to begin playing. A new sport could rise to the forefront of entertainment, that being basketball, but a lot of people never knew that this sport existed or didn't know that this sport existed at the time. You could be a trained athlete, but if you couldn't afford the club dues, uniforms, and travel fees, you're basically just walled off from basketball. It didn't recognize you. And you didn't recognize it either because you didn't even know what it was. Why would you spend all this money to do this sport that you have no way to try out or do anything for? So, yeah, it was not even a high school sport. It wasn't a college sport. There wasn't school teams. There wasn't local tournaments. There wasn't even a public development system. It was kind of like, hey, this social club of, higher elite people would play basketball and they were good at it, and there was, leagues that emerged from that. But if you weren't wealthy, it was very hard to get into it. Even though the sport had talent, its potential was nowhere near realized because, well, what were you going to do? You couldn't join a league. And this was the world that Emmanuel Raisa himself was born into. Emmanuel Raisa. His full name was Emmanuel Osama Raisa. He was born in Camden, New Jersey, and when he played, he was a point guard who was 6'1", and he was a very shifty and crafty player who was a pass-first player as well. So, Emmanuel Raisa grew up with next to nothing. His family lived in a cramped apartment above their repair shop. His mother worked long hours, and his father was doing labor jobs in and out of, whatever he could get. Sometimes working docks, sometimes construction, stuff like that. But Emmanuel Raisa loved basketball. Initially, he was able to catch wind of the sport from one of his classmates' fathers, who was actually a professional player in one of the East Coast circuits, which, on a side note, this is before the three professional leagues that I will talk about later even emerged. This is very, very primitive. The man's name was Harold Greenwich, and he was very kind and often took both his son and Emmanuel Raisa to the gyms he played in after hours, which they continued the tradition for years and years until Emmanuel was in 8th grade and ready to move to high school when him and his friend inevitably split ways. Harold Greenwich was, taking Emmanuel to these gyms, but this was something that was very unique because kids like Emmanuel never had the opportunity to play in gyms like these, and Greenwich saw that, and he ended up mentoring him and teaching him how to play basketball. Emmanuel did have a true love for the game and taught Raisa the proper way to play. But the only problem with basketball itself was that it didn't love kids like Raisa. Raisa, without Greenwich, couldn't afford travel teams, he couldn't afford private gym access, and he couldn't afford personal trainers. So, what did he have to do? He had to work. And as he was working, every dollar meant a ton to him. He worked very hard, working odd jobs, random things that, anything he can get his hands on to get money. And every dollar went directly back into his basketball dreams. If he earned enough, he would buy used sneakers or one gym session, or maybe he would try and enter a weekend tournament as a substitute. And eventually, if he made enough, he thought that maybe he could try out professionally. and maybe buy his way into one of these leagues where he could really showcase his skill and his talent. He was basically the kid around the block that, they knew him as someone who would work anywhere or do anything just to play one basketball game, which was rare because basketball wasn't even a popular sport. And as mentioned before, kids like Raisa really didn't know about basketball. Raisa was kind of a, different case. Part that was unique about Raisa was that because he didn't have access to these private gyms and clubs like a lot of the wealthier players did, Raisa was forced to develop his own style of basketball, which eventually became a game so different that it would change basketball forever. For one, he learned to dribble on cracked pavement where the ball bounced unevenly. That gave him a lot of control. He learned to pass through tight alleys and crowded playgrounds, which gave him advanced vision. And as he played against older and stronger men as a kid, since those were the only games he could find, that allowed him to find craftier ways to score. While his game was ahead of its time, at the time, it wasn't necessarily accepted. Although he threw passes people had never seen before, he could stop on a dime, explode outwards in a second, and he used angles instead of his size to overwhelm all of his opponents. He could control the game too. Like, he was 3 steps ahead, but the thing was, traditionally, this style of play where he could control the entire pace of the game and be the ultimate floor general in a way was not something that was widely accepted and not something that the game of basketball had really ever seen before. And because of this caused him to become a hot commodity locally. This eventually expanded into the city of Philadelphia because, remember, he's from Camden. And people from these local areas, started to advocate for his entry into a professional league. And they were saying, hey, this kid's really good. He's really special. Why don't you put him in a league? And one of the men even claimed that, quote, he's no normal player. He just plays so differently. It's like he discovered a new way to play. But that really was just the beginning of Emmanuel Raisa's legend. Now, at first, basketball establishments ignored their people's cries on how, we could get Emmanuel Raisa into the league because he had no club background. He had no team resume, no connections, and no reputation. But when there's a will, there's a way. And Raisa had more will than mostly maybe any person ever for this sport of basketball. He started beginning to dominate local money games whenever he got the chance. Then private club players began inviting him to scrimmages because they wanted to test him out. Then league commissioners started hearing rumors about the poor kid from Camden who passes like magic. Even still, the league would not accept his antics. It was too far from the intended style of basketball that these, corrupted, maybe more powerful owners, wanted. And these commissioners didn't expect a kid like this to ever be even a possibility, let alone be in their league. But eventually, he began to dominate pro players in open gyms and in special events. And when that started to happen, his name became impossible to ignore. At 19 years old, he was invited to a private showcase which was filled with some of the most expensive young basketball prospects in the country. Most of them at this showcase arrived with trainers and managers and the proper attire, but Raisa just came with his dad and his brother, and he wore some beat-up sneakers, and he carried his clothes in a plastic bag. But at this camp, he was able to truly prove his worth. He showed out. He didn't just score the most points. He didn't jump the highest out of the prospects, and he didn't look necessarily like the strongest individual player. But out of the 5 games that they played in here, his team never lost. He made relatively average players from his team look special. He embarrassed defenders with a quick and decisive handle, and he controlled the tempo of the game better than maybe even many pros that we've seen at this time. And this showcase of him showing up with things in a plastic bag became known as the legendary plastic bag game, which was something that shaped Emmanuel Raisa's legacy going forward, because it was the day that Emmanuel Raisa walked into the gym with basically nothing and left as the most talked about up-and-coming star in the country. At this point, he was impossible to ignore. At the time, professional basketball wasn't necessarily mainstream. A lot of people across the country now knew about basketball, but it wasn't nationally televised, which left a lot to be desired. People couldn't stream the games on their TVs. They would just have to go and watch them, and if you weren't from a local area, that was hard to do. But over the last few years, the popular and more relatively local circuits that the best players came from actually had now merged into three professional leagues. The first one was the National Court Association, which was a league that especially valued the tradition of basketball and that wealthy gentleman's game kind of style that they were going for initially. With some of the earliest and longest standing basketball associations, which, came from these circuits along the East Coast and the West Coast and stuff like that. And they were now thrown all together. They took those teams and put them into one league. The newer emerging league, which was actually probably more popular than the National Court Association, was the American Hardwood League. This was the third of these three leagues to emerge, but it had basketball in bigger cities. It had more entertainment. It had ways to make scoring more interesting, but it still mostly recruited players from expensive club systems. And as a side note, people from the National Court Association would not transfer to this league because they viewed this league as too gimmicky or too flashy. The tradition was starting to lose its purpose here ever so slightly. Meanwhile, in the third league, which is known as the Continental Basketball Federation, this was a regional basketball league, which was definitely the smallest of the three, but this was more of had a lot of freak athletes because it was not necessarily people from poor areas or open to anybody, but it was more of the leagues that came from military bases and special cases that, this place just happens to have basketball. But these leagues all had one thing in common, and that was they were gatekeeping completely. The commissioners did not believe everyone deserved access. They still viewed basketball as a game for the privileged, and this obviously affected Raisa. Raisa wasn't a privileged player. He didn't come from the right channels, but at this point, he was quickly becoming too good to ignore. Eventually, Emmanuel Raisa was able to sign with the professional team in the American Hardwood League. The signing in itself was super controversial because he didn't fit the archetype at all. His believers called him the future of basketball, but haters obviously would refer to him as nothing more than a gimmick, especially those more traditional fans from the National Court League who thought this whole association was a gimmick, and especially Emmanuel Raisa. But some owners... However, unfortunately, Raisa's career was only able to last a handful of games, specifically 12. But those few games were to become legendary. In his debut game, he had 14 assists, which dictated the entire pace of the game. In his second game, he had 22 points and made one of the top defenders in the AHL look like he had two left feet. By the end of his first month in the league, which was all he really got to play, he was not just being remarked as the future of the league, but he was already one of the best point guards in the game, averaging 14.8 points with 3 rebounds and 11 assists with 2 steals on 44, 33, 94 splits. But then came the injury. During a fast break, Emmanuel Raisa planted his foot down to change directions where his defender clipped his leg from the side, which caused his knee to buckle, and the whole arena fell silent. This was incredibly unfortunate. To see a knee twist like this is something that if you liked or you hated the guy, you would never wish upon any person. The official report was calling it a severe knee injury at first, nothing super specific because of the time, but once again, because of the time, physical therapy and sports medicine just weren't developed enough. He was 20 years old and he was never able to return to the player he once was. The basketball world moved on relatively quickly. Owners shrugged. This was the best case scenario for protecting traditions, and the leagues just kept on playing like nothing happened. But Raisa could never move on. He watched from the outside and realized something painful. He had barely made it in for only these 12 games, but it really was something special. He was one of the lucky ones. There were thousands of players who would never get that close. But here came the question that changed basketball. After the injury, Raisa was held out for 2 years, and he tried to make a return to professional ball, except he was nowhere near his same level. He played for a couple more years, but it really was not a graceful sight. People kind of chalked him up as finished, and he was not done with basketball per se, maybe in a playing sense, but he was over the nature of professional basketball. One night, he was watching a private club tournament from the stands, and he noticed something, that the players were good, but they really weren't anything special. I mean, he knew better athletes from off the streets and better players from rare public park tournaments. They just weren't allowed into the system. And that night, Raisa wrote down a sentence in a journal that became the foundation of everything he would aspire to do, which also would later become famous, where he says, I know hoopers are out there who could go professional under different circumstances, so let's make sure everyone gets a chance to shine. That became the birth of the Raisa movement, and it would spread like true wildfire. And thus began the emergence of the Raisa camps. The first Raisa camp was nowhere near a glorious sight, a glamorous sight. Even though he had professional basketball player salary at the time, that was barely enough to make a living, not the extravagant salary that's associated with basketball players today. This Raisa camp, in a rented warehouse gym with uneven floors and cheap folding chairs if anybody wanted to come and watch. And Raisa used nearly all of his injury settlement money to rent out this space and buy a few basketballs, also hire a few friends to help coach, a few people who could mentor these young kids that were supposed to come to the camp. He put out flyers for it, and it said, no money required, come to a Raisa camp to change basketball. And for the first time, basketball players from poor neighborhoods were able to get an opportunity. This was nothing near traditional. These camps were open to everybody. And although this gym had a maximum capacity of 80 players around the Camden area, more than 600 people showed up. Some people never played indoors and some people traveled for days, but no matter what the circumstance was, Raisa never turned them away. And instead, he said that a locked door made him late to the game and he himself will not become another locked door. And this is part of the reason of what made these Raisa camps different. Raisa camps were not of the same nature that a tryout was for professionals. They basically were a basketball laboratory. Most camps at the time, besides the Raisa camps, judged players based on their appearance and their background, their connections, but Raisa judged these players on what they could do and created a new evaluation system based on all the following things you can see on your screen, which consists of passing vision, defensive instincts, conditioning, etc., etc. Most importantly, game intelligence, too. A player didn't need to look perfect, he just needed to prove that he could play. And he also introduced another part that would become a defining part of his career, which were his open floor evaluations. Instead of just running scripted drills like a lot of the professionals were doing, you were placed on the games with constantly changing teams. One time you might play with just elite scorers, and the next game you might play with weaker teammates. The goal was to see who could adjust and lead and raise the level of others, which would in turn decide the level and player that you were, which admittedly became Raisa's favorite test. And he often said that great players just don't show only themselves, they reveal others too. The camps also included written scouting cards, recorded notes, regional rankings, and public showcases, which gave unknown players something they never had before, which was a true basketball resume. And obviously people wanted to attend these camps because it was one of the most honest doors into basketball. For poor players, it was the hope of something greater. It all just started with one local camp in Camden, but then it grew to more camps across the tri-state area, and eventually it became a nationwide project that was run by Raisa and trusted friends with also former teammates included. Every camp produced their own stories and their own legends. There was maybe a farm kid from Iowa who could just shoot from anywhere, or a factory worker from Cincinnati who stopped everybody. A 5'9" guard from Baltimore who had a handle like nobody else, or a center from rural Georgia who had been 7'3" but never touched a basketball before. And these camps truly made basketball feel bigger than private clubs. It offered the first form of nationwide coverage. And soon, park ball became a regular occurrence. Kids were putting hoops in their front and backyards, and local gyms now were building basketball courts left and right, showing the country that the sport had been hiding its own talent all along. It was spreading like wildfire at this point. And as it was spreading like wildfire, it was obviously spreading to the youth too. And this ended up changing schools. Professional leagues at first were mocking these camps, where they called them chaotic and unprofessional, but the crowds kept growing. Local papers started covering them, and towns started funding their best players. But then people in high school representatives started noticing something too, that their students were trying to bring basketball to their high schools. So the schools began creating informal teams that would prepare players for Raisa camps. But then these informal teams started playing other informal teams from other schools. Then those games started to draw crowds, and the crowds made money, and the money got administrators interested. And Raisa saw the opportunity here. He created something called the Raisa School Court Initiative, which was a nonprofit organization that helped schools build simple gyms, train coaches, and organize local leagues. He funded the donation of equipment, he wrote rule books for them, he standardized competition across each of these high school circuits, and within a few years, the basketball world exploded. But then a massive development came. The colleges followed. At first, colleges saw basketball as just a way to attract students and alumni into playing games, but the thing was, colleges realized that now they needed teams too because these emerging high school stars had nowhere to go. So Raisa camps essentially became the bridge. They went from people went from street players to high school basketball, then from high school basketball to Raisa camps, which gained them college exposure, where then they could play in college. And a college player might just become a professional player, on the off chance that they still had the same background that was required of most professional players at the time. Emmanuel Raisa had constructed this ladder from the ground up, and that was something he was truly proud of. On the other side of things, due to the rising popularity of the Raisa camps, he started offering tickets as a way for fans to come, and because of this, the camps started to produce a ton of income through these sales, as people wanted to come see the nation's brightest stars play in these games, these scrimmages that were intense and high pressure at the end, see who would make or break legacies. And these, obviously were helping the camps grow. Then he expands to not just local Raisa camps, like nationwide local Raisa camps, it's now regional showcases that, hey, these camps will get together and pool their best players. Then Raisa got radio rights. He then started publishing Raisa rankings in the newspapers, and then companies wanted to follow suit and sponsor these camps. However, Raisa was careful. He didn't just want these camps to become the same machine that he hated, where it required prestige and budget to buy in. So he created a rule where players never needed to afford or pay more than they could afford. Sponsors would sponsor players and pay the difference. And eventually, Raisa created so many things, including Raisa camps, regional showcases, the Raisa National Invitational, Raisa Coaching Clinics, the Scouting Bureau, Raisa Basketball Publications, Sporting Good Partnerships, School Court Initiatives, and the College Showcase Network, where Raisa didn't just own his own camps, he eventually took control of the entire basketball pipeline. Even though the professional league still controlled the top level, Raisa basically had his palm around everything else, which terrified the people at the very tippy top. And so this began the clash with the professional leagues. The pro leagues needed Raisa's players, and Raisa knew it. The best young talents in the country were coming through his camps, his school programs, and his college network, but the owners still wanted control. They wanted to pick which players were acceptable and which ones upheld their quality standards. But Raisa hated that. He had opened the door to all these new players, but professional leagues were still trying to choose who and what walked through. So he started applying pressure. He refused to send any scouting reports to teams that discriminated against players from poor backgrounds, and he publicly criticized owners who ignored the camp standouts. He encouraged players to advocate for their contractual and trading rights. This created a pseudo-war against Raisa and the old basketball establishments. The leagues called them dangerous, but Raisa was just calling them outdated. And in a famous press conference where Raisa was able to shed some light on the corrupted nature of the league, he dropped one of his most famous lines where he said, "You do not own the game. You just got here before anyone else had the chance." A legendary line that became a huge proponent of why the script got flipped and these leagues were forced into what you are about to see. The financial move that changed everything. By this time, the three professional leagues weren't anywhere nearly as strong as they looked. In fact, after a ton of years of harsh criticism from Raisa, the public got involved and they didn't give these entitled managers an easy time. On top of all this, the leagues were divided. They fought over players, they had inconsistent rules, they had weak national presence, and a lot of teams were losing money, which made owners tired. These cities were hardly drawing crowds despite the sport just getting more and more popular because these leagues were ruined. But the Raisa camps were packed. His national showcases were selling out. College and high school basketball was as popular as ever, actually becoming more popular than even some of the pro leagues that were around. The turning point came when the Raisa National Invitational of 1984 drew more listeners than the AHL finals. For the first time, the public chose the future over the establishment, and the old owners were not negotiating from strength. They were now beginning to negotiate with Raisa out of fear. Raisa knew these old leagues had prestige, but he had all of the people on his side. So he formed an investment group known as the Raisa National Sports Trust, where people could invest in him and put their money and faith in him so he could change the league. And that is exactly what he did. Unlike a normal ownership group, his investors, though, weren't just wealthy businessmen. He brought in former players and school leaders and business owners, radio executives, etc., etc., etc. And then he made his move. He did not just try to start his own fourth league, which probably would have been a viable option because the other three were falling out. But he just bought the old system in its entirety. One league at a time, Raisa began acquiring struggling franchises, media rights, league debt, and ownership shares. Some owners sold their teams willingly because they were tired and losing money. Others resisted until Raisa's talent line just became impossible for them to miss. It was unsustainable without him. Eventually, the leagues, now in control by Raisa, he was able to force a merger where the three main professional leagues, the NCAA, AHL, and CBF, were all formed into one national organization, and that became known as the Raisa Basketball Association, or the RBA for short. The RBA essentially was created with one mission, which was a league that showcased the best basketball players in the world, regardless of where they came from or what their background was. That was the key difference between this new merger and all of the other leagues in the past. The RBA was not founded as a way just to make money. It was founded as a way to allow this sport to reach its full potential. And its original constitution included a couple principles that were shaping the league. That was open talent access, so no player could be denied because of their class, school, region, or background. There was national scouting, standardized player pathways, so it went high school, college, these Raisa camps, and regional showcases would all connect players directly to the professional system. There was a competitive balance. No wealthy person could purchase all the good players or all the youth basketball teams or things like that. And most importantly, the game belonged to the players. The league's identity would center on the talent of the players, not social status. This just wasn't a merger. It was basketball's reset button. At first, though, naming the league the Raisa Basketball Association was something Emmanuel Raisa actually did not like. He fought strongly against it. He didn't think he deserved all this credit. He wanted to call it initially the National Basketball Association of America or the Continental Basketball Association, but the players ended up pushing back, saying that the league had to carry his name because he created this world where the future of basketball was changed for the greater. So it became known as the Raisa Basketball Association. And over time, the name became even bigger than the man. And the man was, a iconic staple of basketball. But the word Raisa began to become synonymous with the word rise. To rise up from poverty, to rise up from being overlooked, from a locked out system, and to rise into greatness. And that's why the league's official motto became Where Legends Rise, the RBA. And so this leaves us with an overview of Emmanuel Raisa's legacy. He never got the career he deserved, which was the ultimate tragedy, but in turn, he gave thousands of players the opportunity to play basketball at the highest stage, with nationwide coverage that was easily accessed through your television screens. That was the price he paid, but it was definitely worth it. As in RBA history, the fans do not talk about Raisa just as a founder. They talk about him almost like the godfather of modern basketball. Before Raisa, this was a private sport, and after Raisa, this became a national game. His statue outside the RBA headquarters shows him not in a suit, but in worn-out sneakers, holding a basketball under one arm and a camp registration flyer in the other. At the base of the statue, it reads, "Let them play," which is the foundation that this entire league stands upon.
If you enjoyed this episode of the RBA, leave a like, comment, and subscribe.